Okay, picture this. You're standing on the edge of a freezing, windswept harbor on a December night in 1773. The air is just biting at your face, the smell of salt and low tide is hanging heavy, and out there in the dark water, something completely unprecedented is going down. It involves a massive, almost incomprehensible number, 92,000. That's 92,000 pounds of tea. And it wasn't just sitting quietly in a cargo hold. It was being systematically, forcefully hurled right into the freezing waters of the Atlantic Ocean. To put that scale into perspective, that is the equivalent weight of nearly 25 mid-size cars, just sinking straight to the bottom of the sea.
So, we're in Boston Harbor, and this was absolutely not some random chaotic riot. In just under 3 hours, a highly targeted, incredibly organized midnight operation was executed with literal military precision. The men boarding those ships, they didn't realize it at the time, but as they were hoisting those heavy crates and smashing them open, they were effectively setting off a massive chain reaction, a domino effect that would cross an entire ocean, enrage an empire, and ultimately end in a full-blown revolution.
Okay, let's dive into this, because the real story of the Boston Tea Party is so much wilder than what we all learned back in grade school. It isn't just some quaint tale about angry guys throwing leaves into the water. It is a high-stakes historical thriller. We're talking corporate monopolies, intense backroom political standoffs, and a brilliantly executed covert operation that literally changed the modern world. So, welcome to The Explainer. Today we're going to walk through exactly how just a few hours on a cold winter night completely rewrote a nation's future.
Part 1. The trap is set. A decade of tension. For a solid decade, colonial frustration over taxation without representation had been building into this massive powder keg. And the spark? Well, that came in the form of the Tea Act of 1773. Now, if you just read the fine print, this law seems totally counterintuitive. On the surface, the Tea Act actually lowered the price of tea for the colonists. You'd think cheaper goods would make people happy, right? But it came with a huge catch. The law granted the British East India Company an absolute monopoly on tea sales in the colonies, completely cutting out the hard-working local merchants. But more importantly, it was a legislative Trojan horse. It was Parliament's sneaky way of reaffirming their absolute right to tax the colonies however they pleased.
And this brilliantly illustrates the real dilemma here. Parliament thought they were offering this incredibly sweet deal with the lowered prices, but the colonists, they saw exactly what this really was, a trap to enforce taxation. They didn't just look at it and see a tax on a beverage. They saw a super dangerous precedent. Because, think about it, if they accepted this cheap tea, they were silently agreeing that Parliament had the right to tax them without their consent, and there was absolutely no way they were taking that bait.
Which brings us to Part 2, the ticking clock, a city on the brink.
So, the East India Company sends these massive ships across the Atlantic, and when they drop anchor in Boston, it sparks this intense, almost hostage-like standoff. First, the colonists flat-out refuse the cargo. In response, Royal Governor Thomas Hutchinson stubbornly refuses to let the ships leave until the tax is paid. So now, the ships are just trapped there. Huge public meetings are erupting all over the city as a very strict legal deadline looms over everyone's heads.
And that magic number was 20. Under colonial law, a ship had exactly 20 days to unload its cargo and pay the customs duties. If that timer ran out, customs officials had the legal authority to board those ships, seize the tea, and unload it by absolute military force, whether the tax was paid or not. The clock was literally ticking. The tension in the city was suffocating. The governor wouldn't blink, and the colonists definitely weren't going to back down.
All right, Part 3. The Midnight Operation, December 16th, 1773.
That 20-day legal deadline isn't just approaching anymore, it's mere hours away. If the sun comes up, British officials are going to seize that tea and force it onto American soil. Knowing the time for debate is totally over, a covert plan goes into motion. Historians estimate well over 100 participants showed up that night, heavily organized by the underground political group the Sons of Liberty. They marched down to the harbor disguised as Mohawk warriors. Now, it's highly likely this was purely a symbolic gesture rather than a genuine attempt to hide who they were. Honestly, most of Boston already knew exactly who was involved. The disguise was a message. They were identifying as Americans, separate from British subjects. It was a fiercely calculated political statement.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the sheer discipline reflected in this number, 342.
That is the exact number of tea chests they broke open. You might be picturing a chaotic, violent mob, right? But historical witnesses actually noted an almost eerie, quiet discipline to the whole thing. These guys worked efficiently. They didn't loot the ships, they didn't damage the rigging, the sails, or any personal property of the crew. They were there for the tea, and only the tea. They smashed open 342 chests and literally swept the decks clean when they were done.
By the time they finished and melted back into the dark city streets, they left behind a visual aftermath that was just impossible to ignore. The harbor was reportedly covered in these thick, floating tea leaves for weeks. Every single time the tide rolled in, it was a glaring visual reminder of what had gone down. This wasn't the work of a few thieves in the night. It was massive, undeniable sabotage designed to send a crystal-clear message to the most powerful empire on Earth.
Moving on to Part 4. The Empire Strikes Back. The Intolerable Acts.
As you can probably guess, Parliament was absolutely outraged by this blatant defiance. They launched a devastating retaliation designed to intimidate the colonies into utter submission. Overnight, they completely closed Boston's port, which was the entire economic lifeblood of the city, choking it off until the 92,000 pounds of tea were paid for. Simultaneously, they stripped Massachusetts of its self-governance, just ripping away their right to independently run their own colony. It was a staggering abuse of power, squarely meant to make an example out of Boston.
But here is the magnificent irony of history. Parliament fully intended for these intolerable acts to crush the rebellion and isolate Massachusetts. Instead, they succeeded in uniting the colonies. This harsh crackdown completely backfired. It acted like a massive alarm bell for the other 12 colonies. They looked over at Boston and realized with terrifying clarity that if Britain could just casually strip away the rights and the economy of Massachusetts, well, they could do it to any of them. It pushed the colonies to coordinate and communicate in entirely new, unprecedented ways.
Finally, Part 5. The Path to Revolution, the Final Spark. So the crucial point is how incredibly fast the dominoes fell after those chests hit the water. The Boston Tea Party didn't cause the American Revolution entirely by itself, but it was the final, undeniable spark that forged all those scattered colonial grievances into a single, unified resistance. Boom, within just 1 year, delegates from 12 colonies meet at the First Continental Congress to organize a unified response. 2 years, the tension explodes into actual gunfire at Lexington and Concord. And within just 3 years, the colonies take the ultimate step and declare independence entirely. It was a rapid, unstoppable chain reaction. Which leaves us with this final, pretty provocative thought to consider. When does a protest actually become a revolution? What started as a localized protest over incredibly specific tea taxes morphed into a defining symbol of defiance. It's a symbol we still invoke over 2 centuries later anytime people feel a government has reached too far into their lives. It's just a powerful reminder that sometimes the smallest seeming acts, a few hours of focused action, a few tons of tea in a cold harbor, can end up completely rewriting a nation's future. If you want to understand more about these incredible turning points in history and want to hear more stories of protests that spiraled into massive revolutions, make sure to subscribe. And let us know down in the comments which historical spark should we cover in the next explainer.